I didn't even realize someone had stolen part of my land until my headlights hit it. Just a strip of smooth gray concrete where there shouldn't have been anything at all. And the strangest part wasn't that it was there, it was how confident it looked, like whoever poured it never even considered they might get caught. That evening felt like any other, one of those long work days that drain you in a quiet way, not dramatic, just enough to make you stop noticing the details. I remember driving down Cedar Ridge Drive, my usual route home, thinking about nothing in particular, maybe what I'd throw together for dinner, maybe whether I had the energy to even cook, and then my headlights caught something off to the right, just at the edge of my yard, a clean reflection, too clean, too deliberate to be gravel or dirt or anything natural. At first I thought maybe it was just the angle of the light. You know how sometimes things look different at night, but then I slowed down, leaned forward a little over the steering wheel, and that's when it hit me. Concrete. Fresh concrete. I pulled into my driveway slowly, tires crunching over gravel, engine still running, and just sat there for a second, staring at it through the windshield like maybe it would disappear if I blinked enough times. But it didn't. It stayed right there, smooth and bright, and completely out of place. I got out of the car, and the air still had that faint, unmistakable smell of wet cement. Not strong, but enough that you know it hasn't been there long. Maybe a day, maybe less. My shoes shifted from gravel onto the new surface, and I could feel the difference immediately. That flat, slightly damp firmness underfoot. And I remember thinking, this is new. This is very new. The edge of what used to be my driveway wasn't my driveway anymore. It had been widened. Not subtly, not in a way you could chalk up to some misunderstanding or sloppy work. It was clean, straight, intentional. Whoever did it knew exactly where they were pouring. The new concrete extended out several feet past where it had always stopped, cutting across the invisible line that separated my property from the lot across the street. And yeah, I know what you're thinking, invisible lines can be tricky, but not this one. I walked over toward the curb, where the old survey marker had been set years ago, a metal pin hammered into the ground when the neighborhood was first divided up. I'd seen it before, checked it when I bought the place, more out of curiosity than anything else, and there it was, right where it had always been, undisturbed, not even tilted. The concrete crossed right over it. No confusion, no accident, just straight over the line like it didn't matter. I stood there for a while, longer than I probably needed to, just looking at it, hands on my hips, feeling that slow, quiet kind of anger building up. Not the kind that explodes right away, but the kind that settles in your chest and starts asking questions. Like, who thought this was okay? Who wakes up one morning and decides they can just take a piece of someone else's land because it makes their life easier? Across the street sat the answer. A brand new duplex, still smelling like fresh paint and sawdust even from where I stood. 2 units, identical, clean lines, sharp edges. The kind of place developers throw up quickly to flip for a profit. There were 2 bright for sale signs planted neatly in the front yard, angled just enough to catch the attention of passing cars. And suddenly it all made sense. They wanted a wider driveway, easier access, more room for buyers to pull in without having to think about it. Convenience sells, and apparently, so does a little bit of someone else's property. I let out a breath, slow, steady, trying to keep my head clear, because anger without direction doesn't do much except make you feel worse. So instead, I pulled out my phone. If someone was going to pretend this was a misunderstanding, I was going to make sure there was no room for that story. I started taking pictures, close shots of the concrete crossing the boundary marker, wide shots showing the entire driveway, angles from my yard, from the street, even crouched down low to capture how the new section cut into my side of the line. Then I went back to my garage, grabbed a tape measure, and came out again, measuring the distance from the marker to the edge of the pour, calling the numbers out loud as I recorded video, just in case. 4 feet and 8 inches. Not a mistake. Not a slight overlap. A decision. I grabbed a can of orange spray paint I kept for marking yard work, walked back to the edge, and drew a bright, unmistakable line right along the property boundary, straight across the concrete. If anyone wanted to argue later, they'd have to do it while looking directly at the truth. That's when I decided to walk across the street. Now, I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for confrontation. I'd rather solve things quietly if I can. But there are moments where you either speak up or you become the kind of person people walk over, and I've never been comfortable being that second type. The duplex looked even newer up close, the kind of new where everything still feels temporary, like it hasn't settled into the neighborhood yet. I walked up the short path, knocked on the door, and waited. A few seconds later, it swung open and a guy stood there, mid-40s maybe, wearing work boots dusted in dried concrete, jeans with stains that had clearly been there a while, and a shirt that had seen better days. He looked at me like I was interrupting something important, even though he wasn't doing anything at all. "Yeah," he said. I nodded once, kept my voice calm. "Hey, the driveway you just poured, it's on my property." He didn't even step outside, didn't look past me to check, just leaned against the doorframe like this was already a conversation he'd decided wasn't worth having. "It's just a couple feet," he said, shrugging. And that right there, that tone, that was the moment I knew this wasn't going to be simple. I tilted my head slightly, met his eyes. "It's still my land." He let out a short laugh, like I'd just said something mildly annoying instead of completely reasonable. "Buyer wanted it wider," he said. I nodded slowly, letting that sit for a second. Then the buyer should have bought more land. That wiped the smirk off his face, just for a second, but it came back quick, sharper this time. He rolled his eyes, pushed the door open a bit wider like he was about to step out and make a point, but then thought better of it. "Look," he said, "it's not a big deal. Nobody's using that strip anyway." And that's the thing about people like him. They don't see boundaries the same way. Not until you make them. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, just held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, like I understood exactly what kind of situation this was turning into. "All right," I said quietly. And then I turned around and walked back to my house. Because at that point, the conversation wasn't going to happen on his doorstep. It was going to happen somewhere else. I went inside, closed the door behind me, and just stood there for a second in the quiet. You know, that kind of quiet where your brain is still replaying the conversation, picking apart every word, every shrug, every little hint of disrespect. And I remember thinking, okay, this isn't about concrete anymore. Not really. This is about someone deciding my property line was optional. So I did what I probably should have done first. I went and got the paperwork. Now, I'm not obsessive about documents or anything like that, but I keep the important stuff organized: deed, original survey, all the boring things you hope you never actually need. I pulled the folder out, spread everything across the kitchen table, and started going through it piece by piece, slower than necessary, just to be sure. The survey map was clear. Clean lines, precise measurements, everything marked exactly where it should be. That metal pin I saw earlier, it wasn't just some random marker, it was the official boundary reference point. From there, the line ran straight along, where that fresh concrete now sat, like it had been waiting years just for this exact moment to prove a point. No easement, no shared access agreement, no variance, nothing. I leaned back in the chair, exhaled slowly, and for a brief second I considered the easy way out. You know, just letting it go. It was only a few feet. It wasn't like they built a house on my land. But then I pictured that guy's face again, the way he said, "Nobody's using that strip anyway." Like value is determined by convenience instead of ownership, and that thought didn't sit right. Because if you let something like that slide, you're not just giving up land, you're setting a precedent. And I've seen how that plays out. A few years back, my neighbor down the road, old guy named Walter, let someone move a fence line, just temporarily, during a renovation. That temporary fix turned into a permanent argument that dragged on for months, cost him money, stress, and in the end, he never really got it back the way it was. Not completely. I wasn't about to be Walter. So the next morning, I made a call. City planning office. I kept it simple, explained the situation, gave them the address, mentioned possible encroachment, and to their credit, they didn't brush it off. The woman on the phone paused, asked a few clarifying questions, then said, "We'll send an inspector out this afternoon." That alone told me everything I needed to know. If it was nothing, they wouldn't bother. The inspector showed up around 3. White truck, city logo on the door, clipboard in hand, the kind of guy who didn't waste time on small talk. His name was Harris, mid-50s maybe, sun-worn face, calm eyes that had clearly seen every version of "this isn't my fault" you could imagine. I met him out front, walked him over to the driveway, pointed out the marker, the concrete, the painted line I'd added the night before. He didn't say much at first, just crouched down near the pin, brushed away a bit of dirt with his hand, then stood up and pulled a tablet from his bag. A few taps, a quick glance between the screen and the ground, then back again. That back and forth look, that's when I knew. He straightened up, looked across the street at the duplex, then back at me. "You call this in?" he asked. "Yeah." He nodded once, slow. "Good call. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just certain." He walked over to the edge of the concrete, measured a couple of points himself, double-checked the alignment with whatever he had on that tablet, and then he did something small that somehow felt huge. He shook his head, not in confusion, in disapproval. And if you've ever dealt with someone who enforces rules for a living, you know that head shake carries weight. Within 15 minutes, he was back at his truck filling out paperwork. I stayed where I was, watching from my yard as he printed something out, walked over to the duplex, and taped a bright red notice right onto one of the front posts. Even from a distance, you could read it. Non-compliant construction. Encroachment violation. Work stopped immediately. It flapped slightly in the breeze, loud in a way that didn't need sound. And just like that, the situation changed. That evening, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. "This is Daniel Brooks," I said. A pause. Then a voice came through, tight, controlled, the kind of voice that's trying very hard not to sound irritated but isn't quite succeeding. "Yeah, Daniel, this is Rick Calder. I'm the developer on the duplex across from your property." Of course he was. I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out the window toward the street. The red notice was still there, catching the last bit of daylight. "I figured I'd be hearing from you," I said. Another pause, shorter this time. "Look, I think we got off on the wrong foot here." That line, always interesting, usually means someone just realized they don't have the upper hand anymore. "I'm listening," I said. He cleared his throat. "We're willing to compensate you for that portion of land. Fair market value, more than fair, actually. We can settle this quickly." I let that sit for a second, not because I needed time to think, but because silence makes people reveal more than words ever do. "You poured concrete on my property without permission," I said finally, calm, even. "I'm not interested in selling." Another pause, longer now. "It's already been done," he said, a little sharper. "Tearing it out is going to cost time, money. It's not practical." I looked out at the driveway again, that clean edge cutting where it didn't belong. "That sounds like your problem," I said. His tone shifted then, just slightly, like he was recalculating. "We can make this worth your while." And there it was, the assumption that everything has a price. Or, he continued, "We can get lawyers involved. Drag this out. Nobody wants that." I smiled a little at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. "Rick," I said, keeping my voice steady, "this isn't complicated. You built on land that isn't yours. The city already flagged it. You don't need a lawyer to understand what happens next." Silence. Then, quieter this time. "You're really going to make us tear it out?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. No anger. No emphasis. Just yes. The call ended not long after that. No dramatic goodbye. Just a clipped, "We'll be in touch," before the line went dead. And for the first time since I'd seen that concrete, I felt something shift. Not relief exactly, more like certainty. Because up until then, it was just me standing there saying, "This isn't right." Now, it wasn't just me anymore. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet, actually. No workers, no trucks, no movement across the street. Just that red notice sitting there like a warning sign nobody wanted to deal with. I half expected them to try something, maybe pore over it, maybe ignore it and hope I'd get tired, but they didn't. Which told me they were figuring out their next move. And I was fine waiting. Because the thing about situations like this, once you decide where you stand, all that's left is seeing who moves first. By the end of the week, I got my answer. It started early. Earlier than I'm usually awake on a Saturday. That low mechanical rumble drifting through the window, the kind of sound that doesn't belong to birds or traffic or anything normal. I remember opening my eyes, staring at the ceiling for a second, then just knowing. I didn't even rush. Made coffee first, stood there while it brewed, listening to the distant clanking, the occasional sharp crack of metal against something solid, like the morning itself was gearing up for something unpleasant. Then I stepped outside, mug still warm in my hand, and looked across the street. They'd brought in a full crew. 2 trucks, a small excavator, and a couple of guys already unloading tools. Jackhammers lined up like they'd been waiting for this exact moment. And right there, front and center, Rick Calder. He looked different in daylight. Not softer, just more real. Less voice on the phone, more someone who had to physically deal with the consequences of his decisions. He saw me almost immediately, gave a short nod. Not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledgement. I nodded back. No words. Didn't feel necessary. The first hit of the jackhammer came a few minutes later, sharp and violent, echoing down the street in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Concrete doesn't give up easily. It fights back in its own way, cracking in jagged lines, breaking apart piece by piece like it resents being undone. I stood there longer than I planned to, watching it happen. There's something strange about seeing a problem physically destroyed, especially one that started with someone acting like it wasn't a problem at all. Chunks of concrete started piling up along the curb, rough edges where there had been smooth lines just days before. Dust kicked up into the air, drifting across the street in light gray clouds, settling on everything. Cars, grass, even the edge of my driveway, like a reminder of how far it had reached. One of the workers paused at some point, wiped his forehead, glanced over at me, and gave a small shrug. Not apologetic, not dismissive, just understanding. Like he'd been on both sides of situations like this before. I gave him a slight nod. No hard feelings there. They were just doing their job. Rick, on the other hand, he stayed close to the work, arms crossed most of the time, occasionally stepping in to say something I couldn't quite hear over the noise. But every now and then, he'd glance over toward my side of the line. Not with anger, not even with frustration anymore. More like calculation had finally given way to acceptance. And maybe just a little bit of respect. It took most of the morning. The section that crossed onto my land didn't come out clean. It had to be broken, lifted, hauled away in uneven pieces, each one a small correction of a larger mistake. By the time they were done, the ground underneath looked raw again, exposed soil where there had been that clean gray surface. But they didn't stop there. That was the part one noticed. They didn't just remove it and walk away. They leveled the soil, compacted it properly, reset the edge where the property line ran, almost like they were trying to erase any trace that it had ever crossed over in the first place. And then, later that afternoon, they poured again. This time, it stayed exactly where it belonged. No overlap, no shortcuts, just clean lines, ending precisely at the boundary marker like it had been there all along. I walked over once they were finished, waited until the crew had packed up and the noise had faded back into normal neighborhood quiet, the kind of quiet that feels different after something like that, heavier somehow, like the air remembers. Rick was still there, standing near the curb, looking down at the fresh pour. I approached slowly, not trying to catch him off guard or anything, just closing the distance that had been sitting between us all week. He glanced up as I got closer. For a second, neither of us said anything. Then he let out a breath, shook his head slightly. "You really held your ground," he said. It wasn't sarcastic, just factual. I looked down at the edge of the driveway, then back at him. "It wasn't about the ground," I said. "It was about the line." He gave a short, almost amused exhale at that, like he understood more than he expected to. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I get that now." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just open. "You could have taken the money," he added after a moment. I nodded. "I could have." Another pause. "But then it wouldn't have been my land anymore," I said. He didn't argue with that, didn't try to spin it, just looked back at the driveway, hands resting on his hips, like he was mentally filing this whole thing away for later. "Lesson learned," he muttered. I gave a small shrug. "Expensive one." That got a faint smile out of him, the first real one I'd seen. "Yeah," he said. "No kidding." And that was it. No handshake, no apology speech, just an understanding. I walked back to my house after that, slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because something about the whole situation had shifted in a way I wasn't fully expecting. Because here's the thing. On paper, it's simple. Someone crossed a line. They got called out. They fixed it. End of story. But in reality, it's never just about the line itself. It's about how easily people convince themselves that a small step over it doesn't matter, that no one will notice, or care, or push back. And most of the time, they're right. Most people don't want the hassle. They don't want the awkward conversation, the paperwork, the tension with neighbors or developers or whoever's on the other side. So they let it slide, just a little, and then a little more, until one day they look around and realize something that used to be theirs isn't anymore. And nobody ever came out and took it. They just didn't stop it from being taken. Now, I'm not saying every situation needs to turn into a standoff like this. Sometimes compromise makes sense. Sometimes it's not worth the fight. But you have to know where that line is for yourself. Because if you don't define it, someone else will. And they probably won't draw it in your favor. Every now and then, I still catch myself looking at that driveway when I pull in at night. Not because there's anything wrong with it now, but because I remember how it looked before, stretched just a little too far, like it was testing something. And I guess, in a way, it was. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have let it go for the money? Saved yourself the time, the friction, the whole back and forth? Or would you have done exactly what I did and forced it back to where it belonged? Because lines like that, they're not always made of concrete. Sometimes they're decisions.